Welcome, welcome. This is another episode of Choice Words, a series of discussions with real people who are fighting for real education options for our kids. I am your host, Jay Artist Wright, with the Freedom to Choose Schools organization. And I am so thrilled to be joined today by two powerhouse women in the education space. But before we introduce them, I want to tell you a little bit more about this episode. This episode is called Community First. And the reason why we called it Community First is because there's definitely been a transition in our work about who and how we lead when we talk about education. And I'm excited to have these two leaders share what that means for them and what they've done in their own political and personal and professional journey to really dive into community. So we will be talking with Janie Segui Rodriguez with Stop the Wait, Rhode Island, and Subira Gordon with Nashville Charter Collaborative. This episode looks into parent agency and school leadership, how local organizing can impact and how it has evolved over time, and some of the misconceptions around charter schools and school choice. And lastly, how do we build collaboration instead of competition? So without further ado, Ms. Segui Rodriguez, tell us a little bit about yourself. Why this work? And give us a brief example of why you chose this work.
I really never intended on choosing this work. It kind of chose me, but I started advocating for my daughter in her local public school where she was really struggling. And that led me to kind of dive deeper into how schools functioned, what kind of voice parents had in shaping or partnering with their kids' school, and and then what that looked like for the rest of my community. So it was a journey over the years, and really a moratorium is what kind of really pushed me into this work.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to ask a little bit more about that moratorium and as we go deeper into this, because it was a charter moratorium, right, that came to Rhode Island. Yeah. Let's definitely talk about that. But Subir, I want to ask you the same question. What motivates you? Why this work?
Good to see you both. So I'd say I got into educational advocacy primarily through the work of educator diversity. So I started my career working in the Connecticut legislature and really did a deep dive looking at students and student demographics and kind of seeing who was educating our students in our high need schools. And actually, when we ran all the numbers and did all the data, charter schools actually had the highest demographics of teachers who look like the students. And then we did that and looked at the looked at how students were performing in charter schools, you could see that there's a direct correlation between having an educator that looked like you and was from your own background, and that was directly connected to student outcomes. So that's kind of what got me started in the work. And then, thinking through when I had my own child and figuring out what was the best educational option for him and starting to do some research on our local elementary schools. I remember we're looking for kindergarten, and the school we were zoned for was just not up to my standard. I saw that I think it was less than 30% of Black boys were on grade level for anything in the school we were zoned for. They had a very high outplacement students who got involved with the police at our elementary school. So that just was not a place that I was going to put my son into. So I really started looking at educational options for my own child. And that, I think, got me really embedded in thinking a lot more about public school choice and thinking about school choice in general and who has access to what, and how real estate choice plays such a large role in the school conversation. And many times we think about schools just as, an educational issue, but it's so much more connected to housing and housing inequity, which leads to school and educational inequity.
That is so true. And I want to follow up again on like the naming of this. So community first is really valuing the authenticity of the first person and the first voice. Education has many layers, right? There's no one story to be told, but I think specifically when we talk about education, especially of Black boys, especially of people of color, there is always like this one story that's told. And so I'm really valuing that us jumping into this conversation because first, you guys are both women of color who have children in this space, but you also both represent organizations that are working with parents and working with school leaders who are also people of color, which is often a story that we don't get to hear a lot about. And so I want to dive a little bit more into that. And specifically, Janie, you mentioned the moratorium. I know in your work at Stop the Wait Rhode Island, you mobilized around 400 parents against this moratorium. Tell us what that experience was like for you, and how specifically did parents show up?
So, we've mobilized hundreds of parents a few different times, but that was very different because it was the beginning of the pandemic. So, we didn't have the ability to actually all go to the state house, right? Our legislature, we have a part time legislature in Rhode Island, and we were actually like all connected through Zoom, connected like by text message and waiting for phone calls from our legislature to testify. And so mobilizing people under those circumstances was definitely very different. And it was a 3-year proposed moratorium to put a pause on thousands of seats that had just been approved through our through the Rhode Island Department of Education. But we still use the similar organizing tactics, relationship building, contacting folks. I called a lot of people that I knew, a lot of parents, and then they called other parents. I also worked with some of the schools that would have been impacted that would not have been able to open their doors. I literally recorded a quick video on my cell phone in English and Spanish and was like, I'm a mom like you. My daughter was on a wait list for 6 years. We have the longest wait list in the country. And we were able to mobilize parents in that way and have them sign up through a Google form and then just host Zoom meetings. I hosted Zoom meetings for families to drop in. I created a template that I was able to get out to folks. And then we did like old school calling folks, getting them prepped, and getting them to testify for the moratorium, and we were able to stop it.
That's awesome. And congratulations on that too. That's amazing. And it brings up again, like just this idea of, if you build it, they will come, right? Because a lot of times in our school systems, people have misconceptions about how parents actually show up, and often, feel like, oh, parents are not going to get engaged, they're not going to get involved. But you just kind of shared and the experience of, like, if you meet them where they're at, if you call them, if you set it up, if you continually be a catalyst, they will show up, and they'll show up, big time. I mean, 400 is a huge number. And specifically to do it, like you said, right around the pandemic time when, there could have, everyone was just fighting for their livelihood and their mortality at that point. So to have so many people show up in that way is fantastic. Subira, I want to ask you a question, and this is kind of on the same vein, but it's more the fact that you work a lot with charter school leaders. And you and I have had several side conversations where you're like, we've got to get these school leaders involved. What is that relationship like, and how do you share with school leaders specifically, like, the value of having parents be involved in their work?
So I think it's really interesting as you think about, I think many times school leaders see parents as adversarial and parents kind of mobilizing as a threat to the institution that they've worked so hard to build. And, if you think about it, if you think about it from a business perspective, like, we don't want a bad review out there. They're like, I don't want one parent out there saying something negative about my school. But the thing that I think is really important, and that I've worked with a lot of school leaders, like, we have to see parents as partners. And if parents are happy, parents are going to choose your school. I think there is something where I think thinking about parents as collaborators and not as people who are pushing against your system because they have some ultimate outcome. And I will say, like, sometimes just learning from experience here in Nashville, there are parents who've done some things to our school leaders that are just, in my mind, just not being the best collaborator and not being the best person and partner. But that can't shift or jade the way that you see parents as in general. I also think, like, a lot of going back to, if you think about the history of the charter school movement, like back in the beginning, there used to be contracts. I remember back in Connecticut that parents had to sign at the beginning of the school year saying, I am going to show up. I am going to be a partner. And I think a lot of schools used to see that as like a parent and a student, like the school was saying, you are both on this journey with me. And if you trust me with your child, you know that I expect you to also be there with me. I think we moved, that's a little bit more of like old school charter, but I think there's something to be said about that relation, building that relationship very early on, and knowing that like, if your child does something at school, I should be able to call you. It shouldn't be like I drop you off and the school is responsible for you for the whole day. So I think some of it has to do with, I think, just societal and culture and like how things have shifted and changed. And if you think about the demographics that our schools are serving, I think lots of immigrant populations see school as like the solution, and they drop their kids off and they go home like, oh, everything that happens in the school building is best for my kid and for my family. Specifically, I would say like new arrival families. So I think really having school leaders understand what partnership can look like, and just showing them that like sharing information is really important. If you share information on the front end, people are less likely to not understand why you're doing something, why you've decided to implement this policy that probably feels like it's not in the best interest of kids, but there might be a reason. It might be a shift in state law. That said, you now, like recently we had a cell phone policy change in Tennessee. Like that's a shift in behavior in the way that schools are going to have to show up. So just making sure that you're messaging that to parents and having them not think that, oh, school X is taking away my child's cell phone, so I can't contact them during the middle of the day. So like that partnership is really, really important as we think about building out like what is the best solution for families and kids and for the schools at the end of the day, who are trying to serve multiple constituencies and trying to make as many people happy as they can. I also think that like a lot of our school leaders are parents too, and that helps, because I think if you're a parent, you also know like you get a call from a school, what that feels like. So I would say like our school leaders who are parents kind of lead with that and a little bit more of an empathy than the school lead. I don't want to say the school leaders who are not parents don't understand, but I think having someone who's in the same seat, they can empathize a parent who's upset in the moment, knowing that if that were their child, like how they would respond to that, to their student in that moment.
Yeah, it almost brings us back to this conversation we had, or the comment that I made about authenticity, right? Because again, there are layers to how we show up. We show up as parents, we show up as professionals, we show up as former teachers. And it's interesting because both of you have a history in politics as well. So I want to go a little bit into that. But before I do, I had a follow-up question for you, Subira, because the other part of your work is working with charter school leaders. And this has been a challenge for us to get charter school leaders to understand. Like you said, that contract thing is amazing. There's also this atmosphere where it appears that charter school leaders have to compete for resources. And it's like they're competing for resources against each other. And then they're also competing for resources with traditional public schools. Let's focus just on the charter school space. How do you get charter school leaders to collaborate, or do you? What does that look like?
So, the NCC was started by charter school leaders who wanted to collaborate. And I think when you think about like market share, for example, in the city of Nashville, about I think we're at maybe 21% of the market share in the city. Each individual school is a small percentage of the amount of students that are in charter schools in our city, but collaboratively, we make up 20% of the public school population. The only way that you can push against the system is for us all to speak in a united voice. And I'll give a really good example of like something that happened very recently that is like showed and demonstrated to our network that like collaboration really makes sense. So everyone got an invoice from the district for an obscene amount of money based on a financial issue. I was able to have our charter school leaders band together, and that's 13 CMOs, saying we will not pay this invoice until we have supporting documentation that shows how you got to this number. That withheld significant resources from the district that made them answer the questions that we had, make sure that we had the right meetings, followed up with the city, and just ensuring that if eventually some schools started to pay, but for about 3 months, we held the line and no school wrote a check back to the district. That collaboration and collection of voice really showed to the district that like you can't one off one of us. Like if you are going to do something, it's going to happen as a collective and to the network itself. And I think my organization has done a really good job of really making sure that like we advocate sector wide. There's lots of different types of schools, high schools, elementary schools, middle schools, but if we think about the charter sector as a whole, we need to make sure that the conditions politically are ones that allow for great schools to thrive. And I think by having like examples like that, it gets schools to be like, oh, I want to have a seat at the table. I want to be a part of that collaborative because I know that at the end of the day, like we can ensure that there's going to be results. I think even if you think about the advocacy that we do legislatively in partnership with other orgs, then Nashville is a unique city in the state of Tennessee. Nashville is unlike any other of the cities here. And the Nashville's like we have one of the highest performing sectors in the country, and making sure that we're advocating for policies that ensure that our performance continues to stay high, making sure that we're creating space that does not allow schools that are not going to like we hold the bar incredibly high and we want to continue to hold that bar high. I think the collaborative of our schools are because we're all aligned on that as like something that's a priority. It makes sure that everyone who sits at the table is definitely all in on making sure that students have the best public school option in the city. So I think like those shared values along with like showing that we have more power together, that's been able to really get everyone to sit at the table. We don't have 100% participation in everything, but I will say most things that we do, we have like 60 to 70% participation. I think that's huge. And it's everyone participates, just not all at the same time. So I think sometimes it skews the numbers, but all 13 CMOs make sure that their voices are heard. And when I ask for something, everybody shows up in the way that I ask them to show up, which I think is really powerful.
I want to talk a little bit about y'all's political backgrounds because I find it interesting. First off, you guys are both from immigrant families. You guys both grew up in Connecticut. I don't even know if y'all knew each other or not, which is kind of funny. And you guys have both been involved in politics. The question that I want to ask is, we are all people of color talking about charter schools, which in itself is a conversation that you rarely hear about. But we also are people of color that experience other options, right? Other outside the charter school. Um, when you've had to stand on your belief around school choice or what's best for your children, what has been your biggest battle that you've had to deal with, specifically like with some of our Democratic candidates or Democratic electeds who have, quite frankly, don't really vibe with charter schools anymore? But what have been some of those big political hurdles that you've been able to get through by how you show up?
That's a loaded question, right? I'm like, we're in the middle of a battle right now, but for a public school lease for a charter school lease for a public school building. Um, but I would say that, Democrats are definitely our largest. I mean, I'm in Rhode Island, right? Like most elected officials in Rhode Island are Democrats. And at the end of the day, parents want the best options for their kids. It's not that they're loyal to charter schools. We want opportunities for our kids. And whoever is going to provide those opportunities, that's where parents are going to line up. Um, I think that there's a lot of power in politics generally, and different communities or organizations, unions, right, have power and influence, and parents typically individually do not, and that's why it's so important for us to organize to create a balance in the system. But I would say that every battle for literally everything we try to do is a battle in Rhode Island. It doesn't matter how good the lease is, how well it's set up, etc. For us, it's really been amplifying parent voices, individualized stories of people, of their particular constituents, strong organizing, whether that's, individual letters, whether right now we're knocking on 22,000 doors, there's a strategy there. In addition to just getting a pulse on the city and education, we have a question in there that's asking folks if they support this lease, right? It's either we're paying $300,000 a year to keep a building empty, and or the city could have a lease where most of these kids are Providence residents. So that's how we try to leverage people's stories here to ensure that politicians are being responsive to their constituents. That being said, it's never easy and it's never guaranteed. And it's really, again, it just goes back to strong organizing.
Subira, I would love to hear your comments about that.
So I think my experience in Connecticut, and Nashville's also a very blue city. I think if you talk to Democrats who look like us, generally speaking, they tend to be more in favor of charters and public school choice than not. I think like their lived experience is very different from like a white progressive suburban Democrat, and I think you just have to name the thing that it is. I think uh, Democrats have historically, at least in Connecticut, like urban Democrats have been the people who have been on the battlefields with charters to be like, it's the kids in my community that need access to a great public school. I think like going back to like the largest champion of charters in Connecticut is the Senate Chair of Education, who is from an urban district Black male teacher and would always talk about the experiences that he had in public schools, which has led him to be a big believer in public school choice. I think moving to Nashville, it's also very similar. I think Black elected officials are really more inclined to be on our side just based on the fact that like it's their constituents and it's their people who are affected by, I always talk about real estate choice. Like if you live in the city of Nashville and you don't have access to schools in Green Hills, if you don't have access to schools in Bellevue, you're zoned for some of the lowest performing schools in the country. Like North Nashville is the most incarcerated zip code in the country. Like the charter school that is in that district is outperforming every single type of school near it, serving the kinds of students that it serves. And I know that like it is not fancy or right to say that we outperform the traditionally zoned schools, but it just is the fact. So like having those conversations, making sure that politicians understand what is, and that like our families and parents aren't being sent to these schools by some outside forces. These are the decisions they're making on their own behalf. I think that's really important too. I would say like what we have to do a really good job at as a sector is picking the right people to run for office in the right seats and districts. I think like historically we've done a really bad job of like saying we have to have a charter school parent to run in a specific district, and it's like maybe you don't. Maybe you need a sympathizer or an ally who is able to win that district and win that seat, be in a position of power to be able to speak on the behalf of our families.
Yeah, I'm a jump in there too, because I think that one of the things that we've done too is just feel like that we've got to be specific to just charter schools. Like, you fill out this candidate form, and it's like, if do the question is, do you support charter schools? Yes or no. It's not that clear. I mean, Janie, you and I had a conversation before about like not all charter schools are good for us either, right? And so I think to the point is, and this is what a follow-up question I want to ask, because you guys are both come from immigrant families. Like, I would assume that your families didn't know about charter schools when you came to this country, right? Um, but I would also assume that education was a core of what was expected of you. So if you could, I would love to get an experience, like an authentic voice of like, what do immigrant families really value when it comes to coming to America, bring their children here to start a new life? What is at the core of that?
I think I can start. Like, I moved here when I went to college, and I always say, like, the experience that I had, like, my father, construction worker, all that man knew was that he needed to drop me off. We went to Ames, which was a store at the time, filled his panel van that he used for construction, and that's what dropped me off at college. He had no idea what he was doing. Like that school couldn't call him for anything. Like he just knew he was entrusting me to this institution, and at the end of the day it would be okay. I think like as like my kids are first gen Americans, I think like a lot of my friends and my family, like they are making educational decisions in the United States for the first time without the family support of anything. Like I can't turn to either one of my parents and say, "Hey, what do you think about this thing?" But beyond my parents, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, no one in my immediate family has any experience around anything with public education in the United States to help me make the right decision. We
Oh, well,
make
let me ask you, but was education like, was it like imperative that you were going to have an education
You
when you came
have
here?
to. It's like the great equalizer. I think like you will see immigrant families, like 7 people will live together in one house to make sure that their kid can go to the best school.
Janie, is that your same experience? Would you say that that's similar for you, or what was your experience like?
So, technically, I'm not an immigrant because Puerto Rico is colonized by the United States. But I do work with a lot of undocumented families or immigrant families as well. And I would say that absolutely, in terms of the value of education, yes. What I've heard from a lot of our families here in Providence is that even though there's a language barrier, right? One, they come into this country thinking that this is the land of opportunity and that their kid is going to have access, right? And then despite the language barrier, they can see that the quality of education that their child is getting is not up to par and is not even reflective to what they were receiving in their home countries for some folks. And some folks are paying for tutoring, et cetera, to, from their home country or sending kids back because they recognize that their kid is not getting what they need in order to be successful long term.
Now that's crazy. I mean, to think about that, like you bring your family here and then you're like, oh, never mind, my bad. Which I really, it's sad to say, and I don't mean to make light of it, but when we look at our families now, in the education system as a whole, I think most of us have been very disappointed, regardless of where you come into the narrative around education, which is why it's so important for us to have the conversation about options and about choices. I do have, hopefully, I'll have time for two more questions. But the one question that I do want to get out there specifically is, what keeps you hopeful? What keeps you hopeful about, the face of resistance and burnout, especially when we look at education right now? The Department of Education is closing. We've got school choice on the rise, but it's on the rise in the sense of still looking at privatizing school, which again doesn't lean necessarily to the people of color and the choices that people of color want to make. What is it that keeps you hopeful in the face of this ongoing resistance or burnout that we're seeing in education?
I would say what keeps me hopeful, I'm an optimist, right? I'm an organizer. And for me, I'm like, when my back is against the wall, that's when I do my best work. And as an optimist, I'm like, there's always opportunity. And, incremental change is a constant in politics, right? That doesn't mean we're going to get to the other side overnight, but these small wins in between. And for me, it's the people, right? It's the relationship that we build with families. It's seeing how their kids are thriving in different spaces, right? Supporting families and applying for different schools, et cetera, fighting for more options so that kids have those seats. It's the small battles despite what's happening at the national level, which undoubtedly is going to quickly trickle down to our local level.
Yeah, I'd say what keeps me hopeful is like every single time we do something, the people that show up for us. Like a couple weeks ago, we launched a candidate boot camp. 12 people who've never run for office, never thought about running for office, showed up and raised their hand and said, I want to do this. When we go out in the field and we start surveying families, in a couple of weeks, you could get 200 to 300 families to scan a QR code and sign up and like tell us about their experience. It means that people out there want something else and they want something different. So that really keeps me hopeful because I think a lot of times we sit in our ivory towers and we think about the world in the way that it is because you watch the news and you see what's happening. But for lots of the families that we're connected to, they really just want to have their voices be heard and learn about what's possible in education for their families. So that keeps me so hopeful about us continuing to be able to build a movement.
So, Janie, tell me a little bit about Stop the Wait Rhode Island. What is this? What is the genesis of it, and what's its mission?
Rhode Island is a 501c3 and a 501c4, and we help to build capacity within parents. We run a parent academy that dives into parent rights. We have a literacy program that dives into how to best support your child's reading at home. And we have a parent education policy program. We support boots on the ground. Right now, we're doing an EDGE survey. Last summer, it was the first time that we had hybrid school board elections. We knocked on 58,000 doors, made 42,000 phone calls. So we're building a people-powered parent movement here in Rhode Island to advocate for the best possible school options for our kid and what that educational landscape should look like.
That's awesome, and I commend you on that, and definitely want to make sure I continue to amplify your work and support you. Subira, tell us about Nashville Charter Collaborative.
Nashville Charter Collaborative, we are a collaborative of 35 charter schools, 13 CMOs in the city of Nashville. Our goal is to make sure that the ecosystem in Nashville allows schools to thrive and be the best versions of themselves. We do a lot of work with charter school leaders around advocacy, building advocacy muscle with schools, and do a lot of work around advocacy with, I call it kind of the civic leaders of the city, school board, and making sure that everyone kind of knows what charter schools are, what they're doing, and kind of the work that they're doing in the city. But it's beyond just the school buildings. It's kind of working also with community and community-based organizations to talk about charters and kind of the value that they bring to the ecosystem. As I said, we're about 20% market share. So that means like so many students in the city of Nashville are accessing public school choice. We want to make sure that charters we get a seat at the table. We're a part of all educational decisions. We want to make sure that every single person in Nashville, whether you're in a charter school or not, know about the options, and making sure that we can ensure that all kids have access to a great public school. And that starts with the charter schools being the best versions of themselves and being very high performing, making sure that they're inclusive, making sure that every child who walks through the doors of a charter can see themselves reflected in the school building and also feel like they're going to have the best outcomes at the end of the day.
That's amazing. It's awesome. I think it's interesting as well that you guys have been nomads very much like me. Like you started this work in one state and now you've moved to Rhode Island and Tennessee respectively. And I think there's also a unique proposition with that because as you are able to travel around this country, you'll find that some of the issues are not siloed to just one area. What we're fighting, what we're battling for, specifically for education options for our families, is universal across the board. And it is a matter of us having this continued conversation with leaders that look like y'all to talk about it and to share that choice is real. We want it. We're going to fight for it. And it's something that we deserve. So the title of this podcast is Choice Words. And it's kind of like a double entendre because it's choice words because we're talking about school choice, but also choice words. And I got a few choice words that I want to share, right? And so I want to ask you to, like, if there's some choice words, whether it be specifically about education or just overall when we look at this country and how they view education, what choice words do you want to share with people to let them know how you feel about where we stand right now?
I would say we are in a precarious time in education right now in this movement in this country. And I think that if we can move past all of the chaos and all of the noise, we have an opportunity to build perhaps something that looks a bit different, but something that may be more responsive to what families need and want. And that's what I would say.
That's awesome. So building something collectively looks different, but it's something that hits the moment. I love that.
You
What
can
about
see
you, Subira?
opportunity in anything.
Yep, opportunity, ops.
So
That's
what does
awesome.
it take to meet this moment?
Subira, what about you? What would you say to the choice words? What are your choice words for folks?
I think I challenge elected officials and people running for office, both on the left and the right, to actually dig deep and see what education is about. I think it doesn't matter. I think where we are in the country right now, education seems to be lots of slogans and kind of just taglines that people think are important. But like, if you're running for office, regardless of what office you're running for, really think about talking to parents and talking to families and thinking about what they want in education. Usually it's not what people say and it's not what makes the headlines. But I feel like both Democrats and Republicans are swinging in the wrong side on education. And this is a moment where I think we're in chaos. There's a lot of things happening in lots of different aspects of our lives. And we know education is a great equalizer. So if you are born in poverty in this country, one of the only ways that you can be successful is by getting a great education. And we are missing the moment to center that in our political discourse and our political conversations. And I think we have to get back there if we're going to come back to the middle and really define what a moderate or moderation is on both the D and the R side. And that's what will bring people that look like me and people that look like us on this call to either one of the sides. But I often challenge Democrats, because Democrats represent the majority of people that look like us, to really start to get right on education as they think about the future.
No, I mean, that is so spot on. And I like I said, I think the collaboration, the opportunity, listening to us, listening to the folks that work, this is exactly what we're talking about. One of the things that I had read earlier today in an article was like Democrats need to win back the working class. And the working class looks like us, right? And the working class looks like us really value education as a priority for our future. And so that in itself is my choice words for this podcast. I want to thank both of you for joining us. This was a really interesting, thought provoking conversation. I wish we had more time because y'all got so many layers. I invite you to come back and share a little bit more about yourselves and about your work. But in the meantime, I thank you. I value you, and I want to continue to uplift y'all as sisters, as leaders in this work, as moms, and just really appreciate y'all taking the time to meet with us. Thank you so much.